Everyone, meet Biggin, the Great Dane dog. This is him in real life, by the way. Compared to a lot of dogs, he drools a lot, and he's pretty big. Both traits of a good boy. But one day he wondered, how am I the dog that I am today? Why do I look the way I do? Why are there other good boys that look different than me? Well, Biggin, it's because of something called evolution. The change of characteristics of organisms over generations, genetically and physically, because of ancestry or their environment. There's an overwhelming amount of evidence and discoveries that have shaped our current understanding of evolution, thanks to the power of scientific observation. Let's go back in time and talk about how our knowledge of evolution came to be, shall we?
Before Darwin, Greek philosophers suggested that life changed gradually over time. Aristotle studied life forms and discovered that all organisms can be arranged on a scale of increasing complexity called the Scalae Naturae. Their ideas were influenced by the Old Testament, so their scale began with God and progressed downwards to angels, demons, and so on. During the 1750s, a Swedish botanist named Carl Linnaeus developed the binomial or two-part format for naming species. For example, Biggin is a Great Dane and his species name is the Canis lupus familiaris. Later, the classification system that we know today, also known as the Linnaeus system, was created to place related genera into certain categories of classification or taxon, starting from the top: domain, kingdom, phylum, order, family, genus, and species. As time passed, ideas of evolution changed as paleontology was developed by George Cuvier. Geologists James Hutton and Charles Lyell noticed geological changes between layers of rocks. From these two practices being developed, Darwin was able to see connections between geological changes and changes in organisms.
Biggin eventually became so curious in evolution, he became the first dog to know how to read, and he was reading Darwin's research on evolution, and this is what he discovered. That as the 20th century began, it was generally thought that species remained unchanged since their creation, until Darwin's research came along and became a lightning rod for a revolutionary view of life. Charles Darwin was born in 1809 and died in 1882. He was born in Shrewsbury, England, and he had an interest in nature, reading nature books, fishing, hunting, and collecting insects. After graduating school, Darwin was gifted a ship from Robert Fitzroy, the HMS Beagle. Darwin began a long and legendary voyage around the world with the intention to chart sketches of the Southern American coastline. Darwin spent most of his time on the shore, observing and collecting thousands of plants and animals. He described the features of organisms that made them well-suited to such diverse environments as Brazil's humid jungles, Argentina's broad grasslands, and the Andes' towering peaks. As Biggin continued reading, he found that Darwin observed that plants and animals in temperate regions of Southern America more closely resembled species living in Southern American tropics than species living in temperate regions of Europe. Furthermore, the fossils he found, though clearly different from living species, distinctly resembled the living organisms of Southern America. Most of the Galapagos species were not known from anywhere else in the world. Darwin hypothesized that the Galapagos had been colonized by organisms that strayed from Southern America and then diversified, giving rise to new species on the various islands. Darwin began to write a book, one of Biggin's favorite books, The Origin of Species. Darwin got a lot of evidence that descent with modification by natural selection explains three broad observations about nature: the unity of life, the diversity of life, and the striking ways in which organisms are suited for life in their environments. Darwin, however, never used the word evolution in his book, although the final word of the book was evolved. Rather, he used descent with modification, a phrase that summarized his view of life. Organisms shared many characteristics, leading Darwin to perceive unity in life. He attributed the unity of life to the descent of all organisms from an ancestor that lived in the remote past. Darwin also thought that as descendants of the ancestral organism lived in various habitats, they gradually accumulated diverse modifications or adaptations that fit them in specific ways of life. Thus, Darwin thought of evolution as a process in which both descent and modification can be observed. He viewed the history of life as a tree, with multiple branchings from a common trunk out to the tips of the youngest twigs. In the diagram shown on screen right now, the tips of the twigs that are labeled A through D represent several groups of organisms living in present day, while the unlabeled branches represent the groups that are extinct. Each fork of the tree represents the most recent common ancestor of all the lines of evolution that subsequently branched from that point. Darwin began to reason that such a branching process, along with the past extinction of events, could explain the large differences in forms that exist between related groups of organisms.
Darwin came up with the mechanism of natural selection to explain the observable patterns of evolution. First, he went over familiar examples of selective breeding of domesticated plants and animals, just like humans have done for years with golden doodles, from golden retrievers and poodles. We have modified many other species over many generations by selecting and breeding individuals that possess desired traits, which is a process called artificial selection. As a result of artificial selection, crops, livestock animals, and pets often bear little resemblance to their wild ancestors. Darwin argued that a similar process occurs in nature. He based his argument on two observations, from which he drew two inferences. The first being that individuals who inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a given environment tend to leave more offspring than other individuals. And the second one being that this unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to the accumulation of favorable traits in the population over generations. As these two inferences suggest, Darwin saw an important connection between natural selection and the capacity of organisms to over-reproduce. Darwin realized that the capacity to over-reproduce was a characteristic of all species. An organism's heritable traits can influence not only its own performance, but also how well its offspring cope with the environmental challenges. For example, an organism might have a trait that gives its offspring an advantage in escaping predators, obtaining food, tolerating physical conditions, or a longer lifespan. When these advantages exist, increased number of that specific offspring will survive and reproduce, as those traits are favored in the wild, and they will likely appear at a greater frequency in the next generation. Therefore, over time, natural selection resulting from factors such as predators, lack of food, adverse physical conditions can lead to an increase in the proportion of favorable traits in a population. Darwin reasoned that if artificial selection can bring about dramatic change in a relatively short period of time, then natural selection should be capable of substantial modification of species over many hundreds of generations, even if some of those advantages over others are slight, and less favorable variations will diminish. Over time, this process will increase the frequency of individuals with favorable adaptations, hence increasing the degree to which organisms are well suited for life in their environment.
In the past 150 years, new discoveries by biologists filled the gaps that Charles Darwin was unable to prove with his theory of descent with modification. These discoveries will help Biggin determine his origins through direct observations, homology, fossil record, and biogeography. On an extended stay in southern Florida, Biggin directly observed natural selection in response to introduced species, as soapberry bugs adapted from feeding on the balloon vine to the golden rain tree. As the balloon vine population was decreasing, the soapberries adapted its long beak to a shorter length for optimal seed consumption for the golden rain tree. Biggin soon began to question his structural similarities to humans as he watches them walk around. Little did he know he was acknowledging homology, the similarity of characteristics resulting from a shared ancestry. Humans and canines have the same arrangement of bones from the scapula to radius to phalanges. Biggin realized that these human appendages are used as arms to carry his food and toys, while his homologous structures are used to run around the yard. Despite similar limb structures, Biggin is a sad boy when he realizes that humans do not have a tail to wag and only a tailbone, a vestigial structure or remnant of tails that functioned as balance for their ancestors. As Biggin grew more questions about Darwin's theories, he read about convergent evolution, the independent evolution of similar features in different lineages. Biggin's two best friends, Seth the sugar glider and Fred the flying squirrel, are analogous as their ability to glide are very similar, but they develop from different ancestors as they are marsupial and eutherian respectively. Biggin discovered the third evidence of evolution, fossil record, while digging around in a creek. As he dug up rock slabs with the outline of stickleback fish, he learned that their pelvic bone had shrunk over time due to natural selection. This helps humans see how past organisms that may have gone extinct differ from present-day organisms and the origins of new organism groups. Biggin had one final question, though. Why does his pen pal, Paddy the parrot, only live on a faraway island? While reading more into Darwin's Origin of Life, he learned about the correlation between biogeography and endemic species. Endemic species are confined to specific geographic regions and are closely related to the nearest mainland. The continental drift of Pangaea further isolated these species as they adapted to their own distinct climates. Patty would get homesick if she moved to Biggin's natural habitat in the Christmas time, as she is most comfortable in tropical environments. With all his first-hand experience, Biggin believes that evolution is not just a theory. The direct observations, homology, fossil record, and biogeography supports Biggin's favorite evolution quote by Darwin. There is grandeur in this view of life, in which endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved.
Biggin's journey, discovering new things and meeting so many famous scientists and other unique animals, furthered his understanding of how our knowledge of evolution came to be. Now Biggin knows more about himself too, isn't that right, Biggin?